A question echoed in the minds of everyone who crossed Helen's path that rainy night. What could lead an elderly woman, dressed in worn clothes, to enter a luxury restaurant? The story of Helen, an 80-year-old woman, unfolds amid looks of disdain and mockery as she slowly walks through the streets of an American city. With each step, the rain not only soaked her fragile body but also the memories of a painful past marked by the separation from her son, Steve. Helen had a dream: to reunite with the son she hadn't seen in decades. However, upon arriving at the restaurant, she encounters a hostile environment. The clients and staff, dressed in elegant attire, look at her with contempt. Although treated with indifference, she insists she has a reservation, determined to find Steve. Her courage in facing this challenging scenario reveals her vulnerability as she dreams of restoring a bond that has been severely broken. As the story progresses, Helen faces constant humiliations. Each disdainful glance and each cutting word feel like daggers to her already wounded heart. Despite the adversities, she does not give up on her goal. When she finally meets Steve, the recognition is not mutual. He treats her coldly, convinced that his mother had died long ago. The weight of the past bears down on both. Helen tries to explain the circumstances that led her to leave him at an orphanage when he was small, revealing a deteriorated health that forced her to make that difficult decision. Steve's traumas, stemming from difficult years in the orphanage, make his reception even more bitter. She realizes that the path to reconciliation will be long and arduous, filled with doubts and resentments. However, even in the face of such difficulties, Helen refuses to give up. The strength of her maternal love drives her to keep fighting for a new beginning as she seeks her son's understanding and forgiveness. The growing tension between them culminates in a sincere conversation, where Steve, after hearing Helen's story, begins to reconsider his feelings. Helen's journey is not just about reunion but also about overcoming her own flaws and fears. She learns that even after years of separation, love can heal deep wounds. The story approaches its climax, where both mother and son have the chance to find peace and build a new future together, surrounded by forgiveness and renewed hope. The rain continued to fall, a monotonous sound echoing amidst the bustle of the restaurant. Helen, with her worn clothes and disheveled hair, felt the gaze of other customers like sharp blades. Every laugh, every whisper, seemed a cruel reminder of her condition. The sophisticated environment, adorned with sparkling chandeliers and elegantly set tables, contrasted sharply with her reality. She wondered if she would ever belong to that world. As she walked toward the table where she had reserved a spot, her heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and hope. The idea of reuniting with Steve, her beloved son, kept her steady despite the difficulties she had faced. The emotional challenge of reliving painful memories, combined with the humiliation of being seen as an intruder, made her chest tighten. But her determination was stronger. Helen knew she had to try. As she approached the table, a waiter, a young man with an indifferent expression, interrupted her. "Sorry, ma'am, but this area is reserved for our regular customers." The tone of disdain in his voice made Helen's face burn. She took a deep breath, clutching her bag to her chest. "I have a reservation," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. The waiter looked at her with contempt, but before he could say anything more, Helen pressed on, determined not to be disheartened. Meanwhile, at a nearby table, a middle-aged couple was observing the scene. The woman, with a look of compassion, turned to her husband and murmured, "She looks so lost. What could have brought her here?" The man, however, rolled his eyes and replied disdainfully, "This isn't her place. This is a fancy restaurant, not a shelter." The woman sighed, frustrated by her partner's lack of empathy. She knew life was full of challenges and that everyone had their own story. Helen finally found her table, where a card with her name was carefully folded. She sat down and looked around, observing the people chatting and enjoying themselves. Her gaze landed on a young man who didn't seem much older than Steve. He was laughing loudly, surrounded by friends, and suddenly, a wave of nostalgia hit her. She remembered how Steve used to laugh like that as a child before circumstances tore them apart. This memory brought a mix of joy and pain to her heart. When Steve finally entered the restaurant, the world around Helen seemed to disappear. He was dressed elegantly, wearing a suit that showcased his success. But the expression on his face was one of confusion and disdain. He approached the table and for a moment, their eyes met. Helen felt an electric charge in the air, but soon realized he did not recognize her. What should have been a moment of reunion turned into one of the most difficult of her life. "Who are you?" Steve asked, his voice filled with coldness. Helen felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath her feet. What did she expect? A warm embrace? A smile of recognition? In that moment, she realized that the path to reconciliation would be fraught with obstacles. The pain of being ignored, the coldness in her son's words, all tested her courage and determination. "I am your mother, Steve," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But I was here to find you." Steve's look became even more distrustful. "My mother is dead," he replied, anger mixing with disbelief. Helen felt a wave of despair. How could she explain the lost years? How could she make him understand her reasons? The conversation quickly turned into an emotional duel. Helen tried to explain, but every word seemed to vanish into the air. Steve was not ready to listen. The pain of his rejection was almost unbearable. The past that separated them was a deep chasm, and Helen began to wonder if she could ever cross it. The frustration and longing enveloped her, making her remember every moment she lost, every birthday she did not celebrate with him. Meanwhile, the couple who had been watching her began to argue. The woman wanted to help, but her husband insisted it was better not to get involved. "She's not our responsibility," he said. But the woman couldn't take her eyes off Helen, who was struggling to find words that could connect her story with her son's. The tension at Helen's table increased, and the emotional pressure was palpable. Each attempt to connect with Steve seemed only to widen the gap between them. She questioned her inner strength, wondering if seeking her son had been the right decision. Was it possible to rewrite a story so full of pain? Helen realized that every step she took toward forgiveness and reconciliation was a challenge, not just for Steve, but for herself. The need to confront her fears and failures became clearer with each moment. In this landscape of uncertainties, Helen knew the journey would not be easy. But the hope for a new beginning, even if distant, still burned within her. Each tear shed, each disdainful look she faced, made her stronger. She was willing to fight, not just for Steve, but for a future where love could overcome pain. Helen felt her heart tighten, each beat echoing like a war drum in her chest. Steve's words hurt her deeply, as if an invisible blade had cut through her. She knew him, but he no longer knew her. The son she had loved and raised seemed a distant shadow, and that absence grew increasingly painful. The feeling of being invisible, of being a stranger in her own son's life, consumed her. She took a deep breath, trying to control the tears that threatened to slip down her face. Looking around, she noticed that more people had turned to observe the scene, some with curious looks, others with expressions of disapproval. That situation made her feel even more exposed, as if she were on an unwanted stage, every move analyzed. Meanwhile, The woman at the nearby table could no longer contain her empathy. She stood up, determined to act. "Excuse me, but I can't stay quiet," she said, approaching Helen and Steve. "I saw what happened. You don't know her story, and she doesn't know yours. Maybe it's time to listen to each other." The intervention was unexpected and drew disapproving looks from other customers, but the woman was undeterred. Steve looked at the woman, his expression still hard, but something in his gaze began to shift. "And who are you to get involved?" he asked, distrust obvious. The woman took a deep breath, knowing she was risking her own peace by intervening. "Just someone who believes that everyone deserves a chance. You may not want to listen, but she is your mother. And that means something." Helen watched the scene unfold, a mix of gratitude and shame washing over her. The courage of that woman was admirable, but at the same time, she felt even more vulnerable. The pressure on her shoulders seemed to increase, as if the weight of the world rested upon her. A heavy silence settled as Helen tried to find the right words. Each second felt like an eternity, and the expectation in the air made her tense. What more could she say? "Steve, please give me a chance to explain. I want to be part of your life again," she pleaded, her voice almost breaking. Steve's response was a vacant stare, frustration and pain still etched on his face. "You can't just come back and expect everything to be okay. That's not how it works." His rejection was a closed fist, and Helen felt hope slipping away once again. Her struggle for reconciliation seemed to be leading to a dead end. Meanwhile, the man at the nearby. Helen's internal conflict was intensifying. She began to question whether her pursuit of Steve was truly worth it. The pain of being rejected and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on her thoughts. Yet, even so, a spark of hope still burned within her. It required courage to face the challenges and start anew, even if that meant confronting her own limitations and fears. Deep down, she knew that the journey would not end there. The path to reconciliation was fraught with obstacles, and each step would be a test of her determination. But no matter how difficult it was, she was willing to fight, not just for Steve, but for herself and for the chance of a future where love could, finally, prevail over pain. Helen felt as if the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Every word from her son was a cruel reminder of the pain and distance that separated them. When the woman approached to intervene, a small part of her felt grateful, but the larger part just wanted to curl up in a corner and disappear. The emotional battle she was facing seemed endless, and Steve's gaze, filled with anger and confusion, was a mirror reflecting her own failures. The atmosphere around them shifted when the man accompanying the woman stood up and, in an unexpected gesture, decided to get involved as well. He approached Steve and in a calm tone, said, "I can see how hurt you are. No one can know what you've been through, but maybe it's a good time to hear what your mother has to say." The man's words added a new weight to the situation, and Helen felt that, somehow, a support network was forming around her. Steve looked at the man, then at the woman, and finally at Helen. The confusion in his gaze was evident. He was surrounded not just by the audience, but by the intensity of the emotion hanging in the air. The rejection he had built as armor was beginning to show cracks. This was an opportunity he hadn't expected, and for a moment, he hesitated. "Why do you care so much?" Steve questioned, his voice a mix of doubt and anger. "You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what it was like growing up without a mother." The words cut deep, but at the same time, they revealed a fragility that Helen had never seen before. He was hurt, and his pain echoed in her own heart. "Because no one should go through this alone," the woman replied, her voice gentle but full of conviction. "The pain that you both feel can be shared, it can be healed. You may not want to hear it now, but there is always a way back. And maybe it starts with a dialogue. Helen felt a wave of hope mixed with insecurity. The woman's words resonated within her, but the fear of being rejected again paralyzed her. What could she possibly say that would change Steve's perspective? What could she do to redeem herself and show him that the life they had lost could be reclaimed? And then, without warning, a memory struck her hard. Helen recalled a particular day, many years ago, when Steve was just 5 years old. She had baked a chocolate cake, and they had spent the afternoon together, covered in flour and laughter. The image was vivid and so full of love that, for a moment, the pain felt distant. "Steve," she began, her voice trembling, "do you remember my birthday when we made that chocolate cake together? I was so happy. You were so happy. I remember every laugh, every moment. I didn't want it to end. But life took me down paths I never imagined. I made mistakes, and one of them was not being there as I should have." Steve's eyes narrowed, a mix of confusion and curiosity. He hadn't expected his mother to talk about her own feelings, about her memories. "You can't just use memories to justify what happened," he replied, but his words carried a less aggressive tone. "I know," Helen said, her heart pounding. "But I want you to know that I haven't given up on you. I've always been here, even when it didn't seem like it. And I know I may not be able to erase the pain you feel, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to face what I've done and who I've failed." Silence. The restaurant seemed to fade away around them. The people who had previously been watching were now so engrossed that the tension was almost palpable. Helen realized that, at that moment, it wasn't just Steve who needed answers. She also needed to confront her own failures, her own pains. The woman's words still echoed in her mind. No one should go through this alone. Helen reflected on how loneliness had shaped her life and how the quest for reconciliation could be the first step toward healing her wounds. She was willing to face any challenge, to confront the ghosts of the past if it meant having the chance to build something new with her son. Steve, in turn, seemed to be at a crossroads. The emotions within him were boiling over. He had never truly considered listening to his mother. The idea of giving her a chance scared him, but at the same time, a part of him wanted to understand what had happened. The weight of expectations and pain was beginning to transform into a search for answers. Helen's gaze met Steve's, and for a brief moment, there was a silent understanding. She knew that, regardless of the path they chose, this was the opportunity they both needed to rewrite their stories. The journey would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, there was a spark of hope. And that, in itself, was already a beginning. Helen watched Steve, waiting for him to respond. The silence between them was heavy with meaning. Although the weight of pain still lingered, there was a new possibility in the air. What had once seemed like an insurmountable abyss began to take shape as a bridge. But at the same time, the reality that reconciliation would require effort and vulnerability was far from being ignored. After a few moments, Steve looked down, his fingers interlaced on the table. Helen saw the internal struggle he was fighting. The boy she remembered, filled with laughter and chocolate cakes, was now a young man full of invisible scars. "I don't know if I can do this," he finally murmured, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "What if you let me down again?" The question struck Helen, but she knew she couldn't retaliate. Instead, she took a deep breath and replied, "You're right to be concerned. I have failed before. But I'm here now, willing to try. I just want you to know that I'm not here to hurt you." Helen's words were met with silence. Steve's gaze was still fixed on the floor, and frustration began to mix with anxiety. The man and woman who had intervened earlier exchanged glances, realizing that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. The woman, sensing the tension, suggested, "Maybe you can start slowly. Just talk about what's in your heart, without pressure." Steve seemed to reflect on this. He looked at Helen with a mix of anger and expectation. Maybe I can try. But that doesn't mean I'll forgive everything at once." Helen nodded, relieved, but aware that this was only the first stone in the construction of a new relationship. What lay ahead would be a challenge that would require patience and courage from both of them. In the days that followed, Helen tried to find ways to reconnect with Steve. On one hand, she felt a new hope, but on the other, the fear of being rejected again accompanied her every step. She decided to write him a letter, expressing her feelings more clearly. In her words, she sought to explain how much she regretted her absences and how she wanted to get closer to him, but insecurity still consumed her. Meanwhile, Steve struggled to understand what was happening within him. He felt torn between the desire to include his mother in his life and the fear of being hurt again. The idea of opening his heart felt terrifying. He remembered all the times he had wished for her presence and how that always ended in disappointment. One afternoon, he decided to confide in a close friend, Lucas, who had always supported him. "I don't know what to do, man. I want my mom to be part of my life, but what if it's just another lie?" Lucas looked at him seriously. "You don't have to decide everything at once. Why not see what happens? Sometimes people change. And if she's really trying, give her a chance." The words of Lucas resonated with Steve. He realized that the decision to give Helen a chance didn't mean he had to trust her immediately. It could be one step at a time, one conversation at a time. With this in mind, he sat down and began to write a response to Helen's letter. The words flowed slowly, but each one felt like a form of liberation. He expressed his desire to meet, but also his doubts and fears. He wanted her to know that it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try. When Helen received the letter, a smile blossomed on her face. Each word from Steve was a seed of hope that she would cherish. However, at the same time, she knew that the road ahead would not be free of difficulties. The wounds of the past wouldn't heal overnight. In the meetings that followed, Helen and Steve faced difficult conversations. There were moments when anger and sadness bubbled to the surface, leaving both of them exhausted. Helen felt that even when things seemed to be improving, a new obstacle would arise. Sometimes, Steve would shut down, and she wouldn't know how to reach him. Other times, he seemed willing to open up, but fear paralyzed him. Yet, in each meeting, there were small victories. A shy smile, a shared memory, a moment of silence that wasn't uncomfortable. These small interactions kept hope alive. Helen began to understand that reconciliation wasn't a straight line, but a winding road filled with unexpected turns. Meanwhile, the man and woman who had intervened in the restaurant continued to be a silent support, always ready to offer advice and a listening ear. They became a symbol of what they could achieve together, a safe space where pain could be shared and healing could begin to blossom. Helen and Steve were only at the beginning of their journey, but each step they took together was a step toward a future that, although uncertain, was finally beginning to seem possible. Helen and Steve were at a crossroads, each facing their own internal challenges while trying to reconnect. The pain of the past still weighed on them, but there was a new light, a spark of hope beginning to shine in the darkness. The journey of reconciliation would not be easy, but both were determined to try. Steve, looking into the mirror in his room, felt torn. He had always been a young man full of dreams, but disappointments had made him cautious. The idea of opening his heart again to Helen felt frightening. He remembered the unfulfilled promises and the wounds that had yet to heal. However, the conversation with Lucas helped him realize that he could take it one step at a time. He didn't need to trust Helen completely from the start. It could be a gradual process. Meanwhile, Helen struggled with her own demons. After years of mistakes and regrets, she wanted to redeem herself. Her self-image was marked by flaws, but each hopeful glance from Steve was a reminder that change was possible. The first time she received a letter from him, her heart filled with joy and a subtle fear. Steve's response was a sign that he was willing to try, but the pressure of not disappointing him again made her anxious. In the meetings that followed, they challenged each other with every conversation. Helen worked hard to show she was willing to be a present mother, while Steve tried to open his heart, even when the words seemed to escape him. There were moments when Steve's anger overflowed, and Helen felt powerless. "Why weren't you there when I needed you?" was a question he repeated, and each time he asked it, Helen felt as if a piece of her heart shattered. But instead of retreating, she listened. She knew listening was an act of love. Over time, small victories began to emerge. In one of the meetings, Steve remembered a birthday when Helen had prepared a special cake for him. He smiled as he recounted the story, and for a moment, the scars of the past seemed smaller. Helen, in turn, realized that each smile from Steve was a step toward reconciliation. She began to understand that true success wasn't about completely repairing what was broken, but about building something new, a relationship based on understanding and respect. The conversations became deeper and more honest, and gradually, Steve began to trust himself more. He realized he wasn't alone on this journey. By sharing his insecurities with Helen, he felt stronger. Each outpouring was like a stone removed from a previously obstructed path. And so, as he faced his fears, Helen also found herself transformed. She learned to accept her vulnerability and to allow Steve to see her own weaknesses. This exchange of honesty bonded them in a way neither had anticipated. With each meeting, they exchanged experiences, and the friendship that had begun as a frayed bond started to strengthen. Steve saw in Helen the woman willing to fight for him, while she recognized in him a young man ready to give love a chance, even amidst fear. They were creating a new story, one that involved friendship, pain, and above all, hope. With the support of Lucas and other friends, Steve began to understand that success wasn't just about having a perfect relationship with his mother. It was about finding peace within himself and accepting that human relationships are complex. He learned that forgiveness wasn't a gift he gave to Helen, but a liberation he granted himself. This reflection brought a new understanding to his life, changing the way he viewed the world around him. Helen, in turn, began to apply the lessons she learned along the way. She realized that true wealth wasn't having a child by her side, but cultivating a love that could withstand storms. Every time she overcame a challenge with Steve, she felt richer in experiences and in love. Helen and Steve's journey was just beginning, but each step they took together was a testament to the possibility of overcoming. They learned that growth often comes from adversity and that, although the path could be difficult, transformation was inevitable when one was willing to fight. The future was still uncertain, but as they looked at each other, they both knew they were ready to face it together. Tension lingered in the air as Steve and Helen prepared for what could be the most decisive moment of their lives. They were about to meet in a cafe they both used to frequent, a place filled with memories, both good and bad. Steve's heart raced. He knew he needed to confront the truth about his emotions and his past. It was time to confront not only Helen but also the pain he carried with him. When Helen walked in, sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating her face with a softness that almost made her seem ethereal. She was nervous but determined. There was so much she still needed to say, so much she needed to hear. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything seemed to quiet. It was as if the world around them had disappeared, leaving only the two of them and the mountain of feelings that separated them. Steve began to speak, his voice trembling slightly. "Helen, I don't know where to start. You know how hurt I feel about everything that happened, right?" He took a deep breath, feeling the pressure in his chest. "But I also know I can't keep living in this anger. I need to understand what happened. We need to understand. You left me, and I felt abandoned." Helen felt a wave of sadness wash over her. She knew she didn't have an easy answer to offer, but she was willing to be honest. "I was wrong, Steve. I wasn't the mother you needed. I had my own problems and I shut myself off. But that's no excuse for what happened. I want to fix this. I'm here now, and I'm willing to fight." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Steve looked down at his hands, struggling against the internal storm consuming him. What Helen was saying was sincere, but he still felt trapped between pain and hope. "What if I can't trust you again? What if you leave me again?" The doubt escaped his lips before he could contain it. "I won't leave you, Steve. I promise," Helen replied, her voice firm yet gentle. "I'm here to stay. We'll build this together, even if it's hard. You don't have to carry this alone." The sincerity in her eyes made Steve hesitate. He wanted to believe, but the shadow of the past still haunted him. It was then, in a moment of clarity, that Steve remembered the conversation he had with Lucas. He realized that trust wasn't something that returned all at once. It was a process. He needed to give himself permission to feel, to fail, and, above all, to start over. "I want to try, Helen, but I can't promise it will be easy. I'm scared." "I'm scared too," Helen admitted, a sad smile appearing on her face. "But the only way for us to overcome this is to face it together. One step at a time. Let's be honest with each other, even when it hurts." The conversation progressed, and each word exchanged between them seemed to untie a knot in their hearts. Helen spoke about her regrets, how she felt lost, and how she wished to be a better mother. Steve, in turn, shared his internal struggles, how the pain of rejection shaped his view of love and trust. As they spoke, a new understanding began to blossom between them. The friendship they were trying to rebuild was transforming into something deeper. They started to realize that overcoming wasn't just about forgiving themselves, but about accepting that everyone is in constant evolution. Each had their flaws, but that didn't define who they were as individuals. Over time, the tears streaming down Helen's face mingled with Steve's. The cafe they were in, with its simple tables and cozy atmosphere, became a sanctuary of healing. The past was still there, but now, instead of a burden, it was a part of their stories that shaped them. "Let's make a pact," Steve proposed, his voice choked. "Let's support each other instead of hurting each other. Let's be honest even when it's difficult." Helen nodded, a glimmer of hope lighting up her eyes. "I promise," she said, extending her hand. Steve took her hand firmly, and in that simple gesture, they sealed a new beginning. The fear still existed, but looking into each other's eyes, they both felt ready to face the future. The journey of reconciliation wasn't over, but now they had a foundation. The pain of the past wouldn't disappear instantly, but they learned that true strength lay in moving forward, together, despite the challenges. With a new sense of purpose, Steve and Helen stood up, ready to leave the cafe, not just as mother and son, but as partners in the quest for renewed and lasting love. And so, with lighter hearts and renewed hopes, they took the first steps of a new journey. Steve and Helen exited the cafe, their hands still intertwined. The sun shone brightly, as if the very sky was celebrating their new beginning. Every step they took together felt lighter, and despite the weight of the past still present, there was a new energy between them. In the following days, life became a field of small victories. Steve began to open up more to his mother. The conversations that were once laden with tension were now filled with laughter, memories, and even some playful teasing. Helen, for her part, dedicated herself to being a constant presence in her son's life. She accompanied him in his activities, from work to hobbies, showing she was willing to engage and rebuild the connection they had lost. One night, while watching a movie at home, Steve broke the silence. "You know, I realized it's not just about what happened in the past. It's about how we are now. I never thought I could feel this way again, so close to you." Helen smiled, her heart racing. It was the first time he spoke about his feelings so openly, and it filled her with hope. "I feel that too, Steve. Every day that passes, I feel like we are reconnecting. It's a process, but it's worth it." The encounters that were once tense and filled with negative emotions were now full of sincere conversations. They allowed themselves to laugh, cry, and even apologize when necessary. Helen, in particular, began to understand that vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness, but a strength that could unite them even more. "I didn't know it could be so hard and so beautiful at the same time," she said one morning as they prepared breakfast together. Steve looked at her, his expression reflecting gratitude. "I'm learning that even with fear, it's worth trying. You are here, and that means everything to me." With each passing day, the trust between them grew stronger, and the pain of the past began to transform into learning and growth. However, not everything was easy. There were moments when the ghosts of the past threatened to resurface. On one occasion, during a discussion about a trivial matter, Steve found himself reliving the anger he felt. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" he questioned, his voice rising. Helen, on her part, took a deep breath and remembered the pact they had made. "I'm here to be honest, but we need to understand that we're still learning from each other. We can't let old wounds separate us again." Hearing this, something within Steve calmed. He realized that the journey of reconciliation wasn't linear. There would be ups and downs, but what mattered was how they handled it. "I'm sorry for losing my cool," he said, sincerity in his voice. "I'm just trying to find my way. And I'm here to help." "Let's do it together," Helen replied, and in that moment, they both felt that they were truly supporting each other. The pain wouldn't disappear overnight, but the fact that they were willing to face it together was what truly mattered. As time passed, their relationship transformed into something stronger and more resilient. On weekends, they began to explore new places together, creating new memories. Each shared laugh, each tear shed, each gesture of affection helped heal the wounds of the past. Steve also began to notice changes in other aspects of his life. He felt lighter, more capable of facing challenges. Work seemed less oppressive, and he started making new friends. Helen's presence in his life not only helped him confront his fears but also inspired him to be a better version of himself. "I didn't know this was possible," he once commented, looking at the horizon during a walk in the park. "I feel like I'm finally living, not just surviving." Helen, by his side, smiled. "And you deserve this, Steve. We both do." And so, together, they continued to write their story, one chapter at a time, always ready to face whatever came their way, with love and understanding as their guides. Steve and Helen continued to tread the path of reconciliation, one day at a time. The journey was not easy, but the strength they found in each other was like a beacon lighting up their lives. Over time, Steve began to realize that his achievements were not limited to his relationship with Helen but extended to all aspects of his life. He started to appreciate every small victory, from a successful project at work to forming new friendships. Weekends, which were once solitary, were now filled with laughter and adventures. Every outing, whether to a park or a new cafe, became an opportunity to learn more about himself and about Helen. He discovered that by sharing simple moments, like cooking together or watching a movie, he was building a solid foundation for a happier future. With Helen by his side, he felt more confident and passionate about life. The pain of the past had not completely disappeared, but Steve now viewed it as part of his story, a story he was writing with courage and love. One morning, while watching the sunrise, Steve reflected on his transformation. He used to think success was having a good job or being admired. Now, he saw that it was having loved ones by his side and being able to be true to them. What really mattered was the connection they shared and the support they exchanged. Helen agreed, touched to see how much he had grown. She realized that true wealth lies in the experiences they lived together and the ability to support each other in tough times. They both learned they could start over whenever necessary. As the seasons changed, their relationship became stronger. Conversations flowed naturally, filled with sincerity and understanding. The love that grew between them was a testament to the power of overcoming challenges and resilience. They learned that vulnerability was a bridge that connected them, not a barrier. The learning and transformation they experienced together made them wiser and closer. Helen, in turn, also felt transformed. She learned the importance of being present and listening, not just to respond but to understand. The friendship that blossomed between them made her realize that, regardless of the challenges, it is never too late to start anew. The lessons they learned from each other were valuable and profound, and each step they took together became a milestone in their life's journey. Finally, on a sunny afternoon, Steve and Helen decided to celebrate their achievements. They prepared a special dinner, filled with dishes they had learned to cook together. Around the table, surrounded by friends who had also become part of their lives, Steve raised a toast to new stories, new beginnings, and the love that unites us. May we always remember that true success lies in the connections we have with one another. Everyone toasted, feeling the positive energy in the air. And so, with hearts full of gratitude and hope, Steve and Helen continued to write their story, one chapter at a time. They had learned that life is made up of ups and downs, but what truly matters is how we face each challenge together, with love and understanding. We invite you to reflect on your own experiences. What challenges have you overcome? How did you find support in someone special? Share your stories in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more content that inspires transformation and growth. Together, we can create a space of support and learning, where every story is a light shining in the darkness. Don't miss the chance to be part of this community.